I know we started a little late and I've gone a little long, so thank you for your patience. I think we have time for a couple of questions, maybe.
What's your opinion of micro grants?
They're very good. They are very good. We're involved in some type of microloan initiatives, particularly in Afghanistan, with some very vulnerable women who all of them start off as completely illiterate. They're usually, many of them are begging on the streets, or they have they're female-headed households. And what we have found with that analysis over the past 10 years, they do 1 year of literacy skills and numeracy skills, and then they do livelihoods training, and then they join small cooperatives that guarantee one another's loans. And even though these are women who have the longest odds in all of Afghanistan, they're the ones that microloan groups often don't work with because they don't have the collateral that's often needed. The loan repayment rate that we have is the highest among these types of initiatives, with 99.5% of the loans repaid into this revolving fund. And the impact is absolutely transformational. You can see women who, all of their kids were out of school, as I said, they were begging in the streets, they were barely able to make ends meet. They had very traditional views around the role of women and girls in their communities, and they have completely transformed. And even 4 or 5 years after we've studied these women, all of their girls are still registered in school. They're all earning their own money. Many of them have employees. Some of them have up to 50 employees of their own. And the cycle is really, it's quite astonishing just how much of an impact that program has been able to have. And it's small amounts of money. The loans are about $1,000 a woman. It's not a huge amount of money for these businesses. So the answer is that microloans, we know, can be extraordinarily effective. But sometimes what's missing in those is that back-end infrastructure and architecture that will support women in the right ways. For them to access these kinds of loans, we also know that you have to provide childcare. And if you don't, then that becomes a major obstacle for poor women. And so some of the challenges we see around the world is that a lot of microloan initiatives tend to focus on women who are kind of easy in that way, right? So they're usually middle class or almost middle class. They have a way to guarantee the loan. They have other ways to leverage the loan. They're usually literate when they start. And so it doesn't necessarily reach those really high risk women. To reach those high risk women, very vulnerable women, requires more inputs. And unfortunately, the microloan model is often, in the truest sense, how much bang can you get for your buck? How many women, what period of time? And so we tend to just give a lot of small loans to a large number of women, when in fact we really should be focusing our efforts a bit more. So not all micro-lending is the same. And I personally believe that we do need to be reaching a different demographic than the one that a lot of mainstream organizations are actually engaging at the moment. And that's partly because of pressure from funders, right? Everybody's into per capita costs. If you can help the largest number of women for the least amount of money, you win. Because it's a horse race. I sound cynical. Any questions to the back there?
First of all, just thank you for. They almost never do me thank you for. This is one. Thank you for a great talk. You talked about the end products of failure, the famine, the lingering mental trauma from people who survive to face new challenges. Talked about the medical interventions on starving, several other things. You talked about the targeted, raising the tide by focusing on women and girls. What do you do what is there that's effective for the people holding the guns and the boys who go on to war? And how do you are there interventions on stopping that other half of the cycle that drives much of this?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for paying such close attention to what I was saying. I appreciate that. That was an excellent summary. I should have taken notes. And that's a very thoughtful question. In fact, this question came up earlier when I was at the main campus. And I'm going to give the same example that I gave there. One of the ways that you can decrease the appeal of militia groups, and you can also decrease the risk of recidivism, the return to those militia groups, and ongoing violence that we see, even the young boys who assaulted Nadine. Part of it is that they not only are they angry and traumatized themselves, but there are very few opportunities for them. And a lot of these young boys, for example, have been out of school for 7 or 8 years as part of the militia groups. And a very simple thing is they don't want to go back and be in grade 1. And so unless you're offering opportunities to, in the same way that you might for any high-risk youth or youth offender, if you're not offering those opportunities for them to properly reintegrate back into society, then they are more likely to either continue with those negative behaviors or to create new negative behaviors. And that's the same all around the world. And one of the things that we have found through our work in Eastern Congo and in Sudan and elsewhere is if you can run catch-up learning programs and create educational models for those young men and in some cases young women as well, for them to reintegrate at an appropriate grade level, if you can train the teachers to handle their specific psychological needs, that increases their retention in school and then decreases the likelihood of their return to the militia group. So education is the first piece. The second piece is meaningful economic employment. I cannot tell you how many times organizations around the world will set up these livelihoods initiatives where you've got 300 kids, right, that have all been demobilized, that are all doing carpentry and basket weaving and carpet making. And you go into the markets and you see that everybody's flooded with baskets and carpenters with signs and, you know, and basket, and anyway. And then you find yourself saying, does nobody ask the question? You know, so you send these boys back out with this livelihoods training that they can't use in any fashion. So we asked this question, and we started in Darfur about 10 years ago looking at this issue. And so we run these child protection centers in 6 different camps for people who have been displaced by the violence. It covers a catchment area of over 50,000 people. And during the day we run catch-up learning programs for kids and youth, and then in the evenings we run adult literacy programs. But we have also added a livelihoods piece to this, which is tied directly to market needs. And so, of course, in Darfur, one of the big market needs with everybody being displaced and resettling in new areas is construction. And there were very few masons. And so we were speaking to the trade unions. The trade union said, look, if you can get us some masons, we can keep the masons quite well employed, and we'll give them trade cards, and they'll be ready to go. And so that's what we did. And we found that with those young men, the likelihood of them rejoining the militias went down to, it was less than 10% of them did. So over 90% of them did not return to the militias, because within 6 months they had already quadrupled their household income. And they saw that as a very viable alternative to what was existing. And so we have to look at livelihoods as a protection strategy and education as a protection strategy, because prevention is so key here. But I also don't want to oversimplify it for you, because the hard reality is, and I do write about this in my book, is that some of these young men in particular have lived through and participated in so much violence that they have some very strong antisocial, what other people might call psychopathic tendencies, borderline personality tendencies. And many of them, no matter how much you do in terms of education and skills training, and these are young boys who ultimately end up in a situation where they're incarcerated, and that's probably in everybody's best interest, unfortunately. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen in a percentage of the cases.
Thanks. Just by having you here on our campus, you mentioned taught out from public affairs and also the med college here. Our students are asking the question, how can they get involved? And what advice would you give health and public affairs, the med students? What can we do?
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Well, the question was, how do you get involved? I think the first question, though, that students especially should ask themselves is, what am I really interested in? Because if you're really interested in international development or foreign affairs, that's one thing. But it's important to know within that what sort of drives you, right? Because you can come at it from a bunch of different angles. You can actually have a career in international development and public affairs or foreign affairs from a background in marketing, communications, accounting, finance, project management, executive management, MBA, medicine. So that's the most important thing to answer first, is what am I really interested in? And if you really want to be a doctor, then be a doctor first. And if you really want to be a doctor that's doing international development, then in that situation, there are a number of things that you can do. But the strategy is still the same. Build your networks, get to know people in the NGO sector. There are certain NGOs that obviously are more receptive to people who come from the healthcare sector, groups like Doctors Without Borders or Médecins Sans Frontières. If you're interested in being a public health doctor, the World Health Organization, PAHO, and others who are doing this kind of work, you can then approach, if you're working with an NGO and you're building that skill and building your CV, then at that point maybe you're doing some research, then you might approach them to do some collaboration, which is exactly what I did with my thesis research working with UNICEF in Somalia. And then you just build your reputation and you build your level of skill. What I find, there's some great organizations that are very youth friendly. I know there's some folks from Engineers Without Borders here this evening. George Roeder is a very good friend of mine who started Engineers Without Borders, and they're a great group. They're doing well, he co-founded it with his partner, and they're doing some really good stuff. And the nice thing about EWB, and I mentioned it in my book, is because they put students through a series of leadership development opportunities and conferences and events, and you have to prove yourselves, and then once you've done that, then you have the opportunity to then go into an environment where you're working with EWB for an extended period of time. If you are going to get on a plane, do it right. Go with a reputable organization that has strong grassroots connections, and make sure you're answering those hard questions. What am I doing here? What existed before I got here? What's going to exist after I leave? Is this program appropriate? Is this program sustainable? What is the relationship between the organization I'm working with and local community groups? Are these needs being met in the right fashion? So ask yourself those hard questions, and then if you're satisfied with those answers, then make a longer term investment. I personally believe that 3 months at least is the appropriate amount of time for you to really begin to learn and understand. But it's that constant revolving door of volunteers in 2-3 week increments. That kind of stuff, you're doing more harm than good most of the time when you're doing that. It has to be a longer term commitment. Recognizing that if this is a long term plan for you, even those smaller investments at the front end, even though you might be taking more than you're giving at that stage, eventually that will turn around. But talk to groups that are, NGO friendly, attend conferences, stalk people who work for organizations. Don't stalk me. I don't do any of the hiring, just so you know. But it certainly does work. And start university chapters. It's an impressive thing. People look at it. We look at your initiative. And remember that if you do sign up for any of those short-term where you pay $10,000 to go on some volunteer to hold orphans in Ethiopia, that kind of stuff, we look at that like a scarlet letter on a CV, because again, it's a sign to us that you don't really know what you're doing and you're not asking the right kinds of questions.
What do you see as the role for universities in the global environment? And we talked briefly about the fact that I enjoy teaching as something that I can give back overseas. I got a pretty long
So the question is about universities in the global environment. I think there is a tremendous role for universities in the global environment. There is a tremendous role for experts. So often you see students who are trying to build their careers and become experts as they go, and they're engaging in the international work at the front end. But I see so many people who have developed such outstanding skills that could easily be using those skills to teach and to train in different environments through universities and through those linkages. That is extremely successful, especially when it comes to medicine and medical education, because medical education, in particular in many parts of the global south, is there are a huge number of needs there, and sometimes the pedagogy really hasn't kept up with some of the pedagogy that we're learning and applying. It's still seen as a very paternalistic, very male-dominated environment. A lot of assumptions, a lot of things that need to definitely be changed. And so I think that if you can get at that level with teachers, with administrators, then your impact is amplified. And I think that the more linkages you can have that are academic center to academic center, that's where you can really see some transformative change, because sometimes, I'll give you an example, we do access to justice work in places like northern Uganda. We try and do some work along those lines in eastern Congo, try to break the climate of impunity. There isn't a law school in eastern Congo. So here we are in northern Uganda, we're at least able to train lawyers and paralegals, although we have to send them down to Kampala to do that. But there is not a law school that we can actually partner with. So that's the domain of educators, right? That's a university turning around saying, you know what, we're going to partner with University in Kinshasa and we're going to help them build a law school. It's going to be a 10-year project. This is what we're going to do. And that has to come from academia itself in terms of the certification and the process and tying it to the curriculum. And there's so many tremendous opportunities. So I see it as huge. But I also see the role of educators in this process. It's really about building those linkages. In academic environments, it's all about the silos, right? It's like, well, you're in medicine, and you're in nursing, and you're in teaching, and you're in law. And the reality is, especially when it comes to global issues and global health, it's all integrated and overlapping. And so the more cross-disciplinary lectures you can provide and opportunities for students to interact and get to know one another, that has a huge impact. Because otherwise they're just not learning, and they're just not able to access opportunities in the same way.
Hi, Dr. Nutt. First off, thank you again for coming to the University of Central Florida. Sorry that the Florida weather wasn't very Florida. But I really wanted to thank you, and I'm very grateful for the fact that you've actually offered some actual initiatives and things and ways for us to get involved. Because a lot of times with these talks, I feel that we either get very excited or we're very outraged, or from some of the stories that we hear, or we just feel very intellectual and leave kind of feeling happy, but without any sense of direction. So I really appreciate that you are touching on that. And I know that for the majority of this talk, we've talked a lot about, of course, where you're coming from, the majority of your work, which is from an NGO perspective. But we also kind of touched on the fact that development is really kind of one of the core issues. The fact that there is a global south and a global north, that there is any polarization, that there are developing and then developed countries. Do you think that the sort of the solution or where development will sort of be teased out is completely based off foreign policy and kind of the international political arena, or is there something that we can do? I'm thinking as a student now, but then once I graduate, like, what do I do? And we've been talking about what we can do as a university so yeah.
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. I think that I never believe that this is a situation where there's only one strategy. Yes, you do need development inputs, and there is a role for NGOs to play within that, and there is a role for aid. I don't believe that aid is dead aid. I think that there is ineffective aid, and aid that is mismanaged and has been squandered. But that doesn't mean that aid in and of itself doesn't actually have the potential to do the right kind of work if we're bringing a critical lens to it. That's part of the problem, is that so often we've been doing aid that we think our good intentions are enough, or that our good intentions guarantee good outcomes, and that's a flawed assumption. And so we think bringing that critical kind of lens and academic view of aid, I think, has really helped to turn around, or at least establish the best practices internationally, which I think is important. I think foreign policy does really matter. I think diplomacy does matter, and the way in which we engage with the world really does matter. But I also think that if you look at particularly unstable environments, but even ones that are living within a certain threshold of poverty, economic development is also critically important. But it's like aid. It's the right kind of economic development. It's the kind of economic development that actually does consider labor policies and human rights policies, and that it's not profit at any price. And that's part of the problem. You could easily look at a situation like the Eastern Congo and say, well, the answer is to just not do any mining in the Eastern Congo. And after Dodd-Frank came out, there were many American mining companies in particular who said, well, we're just not going to touch this because this is just too much, it's too messy, we can't keep up with the reporting, we can't keep up with the transparency requirements. And so they pulled out, and then the unintended consequence of that was that it created a vacuum in which many of the artisanal miners were then unemployed, and that exacerbated already very devastating levels of poverty. And then, of course, you had India and China that then moved in, and they weren't asking the same kind of hard questions around human rights and labor policies. Even though there was room for ours to be much better, they were still much further ahead than what they were replaced by. And so, unfortunately, when it comes to international issues of this sort, you can follow the law of unintended consequences, and that tends to repeat itself over and over. So I don't believe that there is a magic solution. I don't believe that it's one thing or the other. I think that you need a very critical, thoughtful, integrated approach. And sometimes when it becomes really overwhelming, and as a student, when you don't even know where you go, oh, I don't know, I can't do this, and I can't do that, and it all seems like I don't know, it all seems just too big and too bold, I just recommend that you look for places to begin and find something that really speaks to you, and an issue that really speaks to you, whether it's thematic, whether it's a human rights issue or human rights concern, and throw your energy and throw your attention into that, and work with some groups that are working in that area that you are really interested in. Maybe it's women's education, maybe it's women's rights in Egypt, maybe it's, and you can make that linkage with the right group along that, and then just help move it forward and understand it. And sometimes you'd be amazed at, you don't feel like you're necessarily making progress, and sometimes even for me, I fall into this trap. It just seems so frustrating. Afghanistan, I was just in Afghanistan not very long ago, about during the summer. And I remember when I was in Afghanistan, and I've been there several times over the past decade, and you get off the plane, and there's so much security, and I arrive, and we're in lockdown for the first 48 hours because there's been a bombing in the ministry building, and then there's curfew, and you can barely move, and you can't go outside of Kabul, and all this stuff. And when I first went into Afghanistan, I went in through the Khyber Pass from Peshawar, admittedly in the backseat of a car underneath a carpet, but I was smuggled in. I don't recommend that as a trip, but I was a lot freer to go and to do things, and our organization was a lot freer to go and do things. So you can look at that change and go, wow, nothing's happened here, and we're worse off than we were before. And yet, when you sit with the 300 women who've been graduating from our program every year and the 150 kids, and you see the enormous progress that has been made, and the risks of losing those gains, really meaningfully losing those gains if you're not continuing to make those kinds of investments. It's in those moments where you just think, that's what it's really about. It's those small victories, it's those small successes. You can't lose sight of those big issues either. But you also have to draw your strength from those smaller opportunities, especially when you're a student, because you've got other things you've got to focus on. So find that one thing that you feel really passionate about and throw yourself in it. And you'd be amazed at what you'd be able to accomplish.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.